I'd like to call up Frank Snepp. Frank worked at NBC, KNBC for a long time and was told when he was 69 years old that his services were no longer needed. Clearly a case of age discrimination, at least in my view and his. And I want Frank to come up and tell you briefly what happened to him as a result. Frank?
I'm new to the Geezers. I really appreciate your allowing me to join you. I will admit that I've stayed away from this organization over the past 4 years for a reason. I've been in litigation with NBC for ageism reasons throughout that period. And as I quickly learned when I was litigating, any suggestion that you're older and you're involved in an ageism lawsuit can actually be used against you. So I figured the term geezer was one I would postpone until I was through with the lawsuit.
Kelly Lang doesn't like the name either.
What's that? The lawsuit was traumatic. It was long. Most people don't know much about ageism lawsuits. You hear about them, but you don't know the details because they're generally settled out of court. And they're settled before trial. And they're swathed in non-disclosure agreements so that nobody knows what's happened. There's a good reason for that. Big corporations want to keep the lid on. I was in a situation where none of that happened. I went through a full trial, and I will hold off telling you how it ended. The reason I am here today is that no one was able to slap a non-disclosure agreement on me in the course of litigation. Not for want of trying. As my case, and I will tip this, reached trial, NBC was spending my lawyer's estimated $100,000 a day to defeat the lawsuit. That's because they didn't want a Pied Piper surviving one who might tempt others at other networks or at NBC into following my example. Ageism is on the rise today, I don't have to tell you. The baby boomer generation is getting older and it's getting fired sooner and more arbitrarily because for some reason, large corporations, media corporations like Comcast, believe that older workers, who are generally more expensive than younger ones, are expendable. I'm here to tell you that has got to change. The ageism issue is the new battlefront in the discrimination wars. There has been no Rosa Parks to emerge from our graying generation to rally the troops, but one should arise. Because it is outrageous that many of you out here who would like to continue to be working still aren't. And I would submit to you that there's more talent in this room than you would find in most active workforces. That is a shame. Let me say at the outset that a number of very brave souls, some of whom are in this room, helped me press forward with a lawsuit. And buddy, it was dangerous because NBC along the way began twisting arms and letting people know that if they spoke out and testified, they wouldn't work in this town again. Yvonne Belzer testified for me. Very bravely. Lou Rothbart, I think Lou is around here. He too. Bob Long, whom we all know, testified for me. Paul Moyer came to the newsroom and sat with me. I decided not to the newsroom, to the courtroom, and sat with me. I decided not to call him, although he had offered to be called, because NBC at that point was threatening to make public the personnel files of anyone who had testified or would testify. It was a blood sport. And it is extremely difficult. In early October of 2012, the general manager of KNBC and the news director, by the way, both of them are still in place, hauled me in and told me I was fired. They said they were eliminating me because they were eliminating my position. That was a little suspect because there were at least 15 other employees in the newsroom at the time who had the same job title as I did, and 2 of them were specialists in investigative journalism, as I pretended to be. Only one thing distinguished me from them. At age 69, I was the oldest guy, oldest personnel worker in the newsroom. Within a year, I filed a major lawsuit against NBC, the mothership, and KNBC for age discrimination, wrongful termination, and retaliation. That last allegation, that last charge, alleges that while I was still an employee, I was punished for raising age discrimination complaints with the HR department. It is illegal to punish someone for raising age complaints. So I wanted to be on record and in court pushing back. It took 4 years to get my case to trial. It was like offering my neck to a vampire. All my energies were drained. My family life was put on hold. Nothing mattered but the lawsuit and my lawyers. One of the major handicaps when you bring one of these cases is the law itself. State and federal ageism statutes are written to favor the corporations, the employers. Under state law, you can win an ageism case if you can prove that age discrimination was a substantial reason for your terminations. Fix on that word, substantial. You can also win with inferential evidence. You don't need a smoking gun. You don't have to show that somebody walked up to you and said, "Hey, buddy, you're fired because you're too old." But wait a minute. What does substantial mean? What does inferential evidence mean? What qualifies as inferential evidence? Well, there's the rub, isn't it? They're so vague, so fluid, so elusive concepts that it's almost impossible to convey to a jury what they mean. A lot of confusion. And then, of course, there are the costs of going up against Goliath. I didn't have a bloody red cent. When I was fired, I refused the puny severance package offered to me, by the way, with a non-disclosure agreement attached, and walked out of the newsroom with nothing. Therefore, all of the attorneys I hired had to work on contingency. In 4 years, I blasted through 3 major law firms. At one point, I had to represent myself before the judge because no lawyer would take the case on contingency. Every one of my law firms put what amounted to a lien on the case, reserving a huge bite of the financial pie that might result from a successful outcome. To make things worse, the 10 lawyers working for NBC, not for KNBC, for NBC, the 10 lawyers did everything possible to make the lawsuit as costly and complicated and time-consuming as possible in hopes that my side would just collapse from exhaustion and cry uncle. They also executed a lot of U-turns to stir the waters. Early on, they dropped their claim that I had been eliminated because of the elimination of my job, and they substituted another argument. They said they'd fired me for poor performance, for being an outlier, out of control. Well, that was pretty rich, too. When Bob Long hired me in 2005, he gave me a very well-defined mission. He wanted me to do in-depth exclusive stories for the anchors to enhance the station's brand as the place to go for investigative stories. And, very important, he had me answer to him alone. I was basically his vest pocket gumshoe. Not because he loved me, but because of the sensitivity of the stories he wanted me to pursue. That job he created for me remained my job right up to the time of my termination. I continue to do signature anchor-driven pieces under the direct control of the news directors. Todd McTorrey, my last news director, still at KNBC, exercised exactly the kind of direct control over me Bob had 7 years before. He even co-produced with me my final investigation that was completed, packaged, and ready to air on the very day Todd and General Manager Steve Colston fired me. NBC's lawyers also kept an iron grip on me, vetting all of my stories, and when the owner of the Staples Arena in downtown Los Angeles sued NBC and me personally in 2007 for one of my investigations, the legal staff of NBC drew me even closer and made me virtually a member of the defense team. I could not breathe without the okay of the lawyers. And that was the way it was right up to the day I was terminated. Incidentally, based on my reporting and, frankly, my supposed credibility, NBC was able to resolve the lawsuit. Satisfactory. It was dismissed 6 weeks before I was terminated. In the last filings in that suit, NBC praised me to the skies saying I was an outstanding journalist who won almost every imaginable award, including a Peabody, which I had brought to NBC, its first in 30 years. Now, against that record, which was all documented, no one could honestly say that I was a guy out of control or that I hadn't done a pretty good job. But NBC had another weapon. In 2009, NBC adopted a new business model for its owned and operated stations. The objective was to trim costs to make NBC Universal cheaper and an attractive acquisition target for potential buyers, like Comcast, which finally took the bait. Under this new plan, stay with me, it gets a little hairy here. Under this new plan, all production personnel at the owned and operated stations, all news writers, all video editors, all photographers, and all producers had to resign their positions. That's right, folks, resign their positions, and then apply to be rehired under a new job title. One single job title, content producer. Nice, slick, very modern, okay? It was a one-size-fits-all. One size fits all. There was no job description attached to it. There were no performance standards. There were no union protections at all. NBC had given itself a license to whack anybody under almost any circumstances. It was like you were hit over the head with a handful of mercury. There was one tip-off to the principal target of this new plan. There was one background requirement for content producer. You had to have 1 year of journalistic experience. Do you hear that? 1 year of journalistic experience. That meant that an intern out of J school could get the jump in the hiring line ahead of a 30-year veteran. The National Labor Relations Board got wind of this, and in 2011 ruled that the content center concept and the content producer title were scams. But by then, the damage had been done. At KNBC, 50% of the production staff had been fired or laid off, and literally the entire edit staff. There were 2 craft editors left in the entire building. Not surprisingly, a lot of the disappeared were the more expensive, the more unionized, the more senior, therefore expensive, employees. Age was taking a hit, folks. Age was taking a hit. And it wasn't being done in the shadows. It was right there in the newsroom, for anyone to see. I was one of those targeted. And what was done to me was typical of what happened to a lot of older employees. Bob Long's successor, a guy named Steve Lang, isolated me, pulled my resources so that my productivity fell off, and then he set me up for failure that way. I didn't take that lying down, folks. I filed a complaint with the HR department alleging age discrimination against me and others, and Steve Lang was fired within 6 months. His successor, Vicki Burns, who had actually helped create the Content Center model when she was previously in New York, did the same thing to me, and she was fired, possibly because the National Labor Relations Board said that her handiwork was a scam. But Vicki Burns had left my personnel file papered with hints and innuendo that with my job title change, when I'd become content producer, my investigative duties had gone away, that I'd become a news writer, and I'd done that job poorly, even though I had never, ever been assigned a news writer slot anywhere, any time. But folks, once you put something like that in a file, it never goes away. And there it was for NBC's lawyers to resurrect against me in the ageism lawsuit that I brought. Last summer, as my case wound its way through the court, NBC asked the judge to rule against me summarily based on the bogus job description, that I was this news writer who wouldn't do news writing. My lawyers argued that NBC was simply trying to smokescreen what was really going on. And since most of the people who had been removed had been saddled with non-disclosure agreements, we couldn't just go, my legal team and I, and ask them. We couldn't go to Yvonne Belcher and say, Yvonne, what really happened? But we needed their testimony. We couldn't go and find out if it would be useful to us. One man, one brave guy, saved my hide just as it looked as though the lawsuit was going to collapse. His name was Todd Reed. He was a young executive producer who left KNBC on his own in 2012. He'd gone off and worked for Al Jazeera. But he knew that I had remained an investigative producer under the direction of the news director, controlled by the news director. NBC went to him and cajoled him and threatened him, he said, and raised the fear that he wouldn't be able to get a job at NBC again if he testified, but he did. He filed a declaration that enabled my lawyers to hold the line, that enabled my lawyers to beat back part of an effort by NBC to get what is called a summary judgment against me so that they wouldn't go to trial. But NBC did win half a victory, and forgive me for getting down on the weeds, but we're talking about a media company dedicated supposedly to transparency and honesty, but I'm going to tell you what happened next. They won half a victory on the basis of outright deception. They filed declarations from Steve Carlston, the general manager, and Todd McTorry, the news director, saying that only they had been involved in my termination, and that neither of them knew I had filed any complaints with the HR department. Sounds very technical, doesn't it? Well, only later did we realize and find that wasn't so. So NBC just lied. We didn't find out that about that in time to get the judge to amend his ruling. So the judge forced us to go into trial without being able to show or even refer to the ageism complaints I had filed with the HR department. This is a company dedicated to truth-telling and transparency, and they had just managed to persuade the judge to bury a critical truth, a fact, in my case. NBC also succeeded in persuading the judge to severely limit the other evidence we could put into court, we could bring to court. We were prevented from mentioning Comcast, even bringing the name up. We were prevented from mentioning the Staples lawsuit in which nice things had been said about me. We were unable to force NBC to produce any information on the numbers of people who had been fired over the past few years, let alone whether or not any of them were 40 years or older, 40 years of age or older. Another, the critical information, the critical issue in my lawsuit. My lawyers tried to even the odds by using subpoena power to get at the former employees who were covered by non-disclosure agreements. Again, a gamble, because we weren't able to talk to them in advance, but we were able to ensure that they could testify honestly. The case went to trial early last December. I was on the witness stand for 15 hours as NBC tried to savage my ethics and performance and to confuse the jury about what my job responsibilities had been and whether or not I had adapted properly to them. We were able to put on our brilliant witnesses, our brave witnesses, and they told a story that chilled everyone. Yvonne Belzer, Lou, Bob Guerrero, Todd Reed, and Warren Stern confirmed that ageism had been very evident in this newsroom, that I had been an investigative journalist, as I was claiming. And Warren Stern, who currently still works for NBC and is a union shop steward, made clear that the discriminatory practices, the age discrimination we had all experienced, continues today at NBC's owned and operated stations. The case went to the jury, and they came in with a verdict on Christmas Eve. Five of the jurors sided with NBC. The majority, 7, voted for me. But this was too short of the 9 out of 12. The 9 out of 12 you need to get a verdict in a civil lawsuit like this. The judge declared a mistrial. My lawyers immediately filed for a new trial and filed motions calling on the judge to sanction NBC for the fraud and distortions it had submitted and committed earlier in the lawsuit. Within 2 days of those motions, NBC agreed to a mediated settlement of the case. It did involve a payout, but the terms of the settlement are confidential. But at no point did NBC manage to impose a gag order, a non-disclosure agreement on me. So I am continuing to report and will be writing about this case and the lessons learned. After the case was over, my lawyers and I questioned the jurors about how they reached their decision and why they had not been able, all of them, to side for me. They all indicated to us they had not even begun to understand what ageism law was. They didn't even understand what was meant by a protected class. Under law, that means the class of people 40 years and older who are entitled to special protection under ageism laws. They didn't know this. They didn't know what an at-will employee is. And one swing juror who might have sided with me but didn't said that she hadn't because she decided that age discrimination was only 30% of the reason I'd been terminated. 30%, she thought, was not enough of a reason. Under law, it's more than enough. So ignorance of the law was critical to the way this suit came to an end. One of the major lessons learned that I'll be talking about and writing about concerning ageism cases and how you win them is that you need to be aware of the warning signs, that you're being set up for the kill. Most corporations, and NBC was typical, follow a 4-step countdown to termination. Sum it up this way: isolate, emasculate, denigrate, terminate. You're isolated within your workplace, so you're out of the loop. You're denied resources, so your productivity falls off. Then the denigration occurs. You suddenly get performance reviews that criticize you arbitrarily for the fall off in your productivity. And then you're confronted with an ultimatum. Accept a leveraged buyout, not what you deserve, with a non-disclosure agreement attached so you don't talk about it, or be fired with nothing. There are a lot of other steps you can take to protect yourself along the way. Watch for the warning signs.
Frank, you're a very, very brave person. And I think you held all of us wrapped with this story. It's affected so many of us in this room. Some of us very directly. And thank you for being here.